When most people imagine who actually purchases American government debt, they tend to think of foreign nations like China or Japan. Maybe wealthy investors or massive pension funds. But here's the twist that should keep you up at night: America's largest creditor isn't a foreign power or a Wall Street giant. It's America itself. The Federal Reserve, the nation's own central bank, has turned into the biggest buyer of U.S. Treasury bonds, generating money from nothing to acquire debt issued by the very government it serves. This isn't some obscure financial detail. It's the core engine of the modern American economic system. And it functions on a cycle so circular it borders on absurd. We are living through the boldest monetary experiment in human history. A structure where the government borrows money. The central bank creates money to buy that debt. And somehow, this is supposed to produce national prosperity. It's like a financial version of a perpetual motion device. Except perpetual motion machines don't exist in physics, and they don't exist in economics either. Yet somehow we've built our entire monetary framework around one. Let me show you how this mechanism works. Because once you finally see it, you'll never view money the same way again. When the U.S. Treasury needs funding, it issues bonds. These are IOUs, pledges to repay borrowed funds with interest over time. In the past, these bonds went to real investors with real capital. Banks, insurance companies, foreign governments, wealthy savers, people who had accumulated real resources and were willing to lend them to Uncle Sam in exchange for stable returns. But something transformed after the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve, which previously played a more limited role in government debt purchases, suddenly became the primary buyer. Through a program known as quantitative easing, the Fed began purchasing Treasury bonds on a scale that dwarfed anything in U.S. history. Between 2008 and 2021, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet surged from under $1 trillion to almost $9 trillion. Most of this expansion came from buying government bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Here's where it becomes truly mind-twisting. The Federal Reserve does not possess $9 trillion sitting in some vault. It manufactures that money electronically with nothing more than keystrokes. Digital dollars summoned into being solely to buy government IOUs. The Treasury issues the bonds to the Federal. The Fed pays with newly created currency. And the Treasury uses that money to run the government. It's a closed loop so perfect it would make a counterfeiter envious. Except it's legal, because the people doing it wrote the rules. Consider the implications. The government spends money it doesn't have by borrowing from a central bank that invents the money it lends. The debt grows, which requires more money creation to buy more debt, which expands the debt further, requiring even more money printing. It's a self-feeding system, expanding with every turn. And we're told that this isn't just normal, it's essential for stability. But it gets stranger. When the Federal Reserve buys Treasury bonds, it doesn't simply keep the interest the way normal investors do. It returns most of that interest straight back to the Treasury. Meaning the government is effectively paying interest to itself on money created from nothing. It's like borrowing from your left pocket to pay your right pocket, then sending the interest back to your left pocket. And somehow, this is presented as creating national wealth. The scale of this system is enormous. As of 2023, the Federal Reserve holds more than $5 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities. That's around 1/4 of all outstanding federal debt. Add in the mortgage-backed securities, and the Fed controls assets worth more than the total annual output of most nations. This isn't monetary policy anymore. It's monetary fiction, a model operating on principles that would be labeled fraud if anyone else attempted them. And here's the punchline. This is no longer an emergency tool. What began as a crisis response in 2008 has turned into the permanent operating mode. During the pandemic, when the government needed trillions for relief spending, who bought the debt? The Federal Reserve, generating even more money to absorb even more bonds, swelling its balance sheet by additional trillions. The mechanism had become so fundamental that shutting it down wasn't even discussed. Now you might wonder, if this system is so unstable, why hasn't everything collapsed? Why hasn't the economy imploded under endless money creation and circular debt? The explanation lies in what economists call the exorbitant privilege. Because the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, foreign governments and institutions are forced to hold dollars and dollar-based assets. When the Fed creates new money, it doesn't stay in America. It flows abroad through global trade and investment, diffusing inflation across nations and allowing Americans to consume more than they produce. But this privilege isn't eternal, and fractures are appearing. Foreign central banks are reducing their reliance on the dollar. Alternative payment systems are emerging to avoid dollar-dominated channels. Countries that once eagerly stockpiled treasuries are becoming cautious buyers. The system that has allowed America to print its way to prosperity is now confronting challenges that strike at its core. The math of this debt cycle has become impossible to ignore. Interest payments on the national debt now consume over 15% of all federal spending, and that's with artificially low interest rates. As rates rise, these payments will balloon, requiring more borrowing, which requires more printing, which undermines the dollar's value and credibility. It's a destructive loop masquerading as economic policy. What makes this even more dangerous is that most citizens don't understand any of it. They see rising prices, falling purchasing power, and widening inequality, but they don't realize these outcomes stem from a monetary structure that siphons wealth from savers to borrowers, from workers to asset owners, from the present into the future. This endless debt cycle isn't some abstract theory. It's the mechanism draining every paycheck, every retirement account, every savings plan in America. And the question isn't whether it can continue indefinitely, it can't. The real question is what happens when it finally fails, and who ends up bearing the cost. The most troubling aspect of this entire model isn't simply that it exists. It's that the entire economy has been rewired to depend on it. We've built a system where stopping the money creation would cause immediate chaos, yet continuing it guarantees far worse consequences later. It's like a nation-sized addiction, where the withdrawal seems worse than the slow poison of staying addicted. Just look at what happens when the Federal Reserve even suggests slowing its bond purchases. Markets panic, stocks plunge, borrowing costs surge, politicians demand intervention, and within days the Fed reverses course, assuring everyone that the money spigot will remain open. We witnessed this in 2018 when the Fed attempted to shrink its balance sheet. The financial markets threw such a tantrum that policymakers abandoned the plan. The message was unmistakable: the system had become dependent on constant monetary injections. This produces what economists politely call moral hazard, but what ordinary people would simply call the destruction of financial discipline. If every major problem will be patched over by printing more money, why worry about debt, efficiency, or sustainability at all? Corporations borrow recklessly knowing bailouts will arrive. Politicians overspend knowing the Fed will monetize the deficit. Investors pour into risky assets knowing the money printer will rescue markets. The result is a superficial prosperity sitting atop a hollow structure. Asset prices soar not because fundamentals improve, but because more dollars are chasing them. Stock indices reach all-time highs while small businesses struggle. Housing becomes unattainable for normal families, while investors empowered by cheap credit buy entire neighborhoods. The wealth divide widens, not due to differences in productivity, but due to proximity to the money source. And here's where it becomes even more warped. Those who benefit the most are the ones who publicly downplay the system yet privately profit from it. Wall Street firms that act as primary dealers for treasury auctions receive the first wave of newly created money. They can borrow at near zero rates and invest in assets that rise as more money enters the system. Meanwhile, retirees and savers watch their life savings lose value as each year's dollars buy less. The Federal Reserve tries to justify this wealth shift by promising job creation and economic growth. But what kind of jobs? What kind of growth? Much of the growth generated by easy money policies is concentrated in industries that shuffle financial assets instead of producing real goods. We get more hedge fund analysts and fewer manufacturers. More financial engineers and fewer actual engineers. The economy becomes increasingly financialized, depending on rising asset values rather than real innovation. Even more concerning is how this system distorts the relationship between government and citizen. In a functioning republic, leaders must make tough decisions about spending because resources are limited. They must prioritize, trim waste, and justify expenses to taxpayers. But when a central bank can create unlimited money to finance unlimited spending, these constraints vanish. Politicians can promise everything to everyone because the cost is hidden in inflation rather than visible through taxes or budget cuts. This is how trillion-dollar spending bills pass with little scrutiny and achieve little real improvement. This is how endless wars are financed without war bonds or public sacrifice, just money printing citizens only notice when prices rise. This is how government grows larger every year regardless of party control, because the feedback loops that enforce discipline have been severed. The international consequences are just as severe. When America prints money to buy its own debt, it exports inflation to every nation that holds dollars or trades in dollar-priced commodities. Poor countries that save dollar reserves as protection against crises see the value of their reserves erode. Oil-producing nations selling resources for dollars watch their earnings shrink as the dollar depreciates. Developing countries that borrowed in dollars face unbearable pressure as their debt burdens swell with each new wave of American money creation. This is economic imperialism disguised as monetary policy. The U.S. gets to consume more than it produces while the rest of the world absorbs the fallout. But no empire built on such foundations lasts forever. History is full of reserve currencies that once seemed unshakable until they suddenly weren't. The British pound once held the same dominance. Before that, Spanish silver from the New World seemed eternal. The endless debt cycle isn't a distant theory, it's the machinery grinding beneath every dollar in circulation today. And like every supposed perpetual motion system, it will eventually fail. The only question is whether you'll understand what's happening before the illusion collapses, or whether you'll be left holding worthless currency when the system finally breaks. History has shown the pattern, if you know where to look.